The Purging of Ruen, Abridged, Episode 10. Shaking his manure-encrusted paws, Percival flung little bits of poo around the lift. "I'm just going to have a little rest and then do the 2 lower floors," he said. "Out the window," Oscar repeated, disbelief momentarily winning against exhaustion. "Yes, indeed. I thought about what we discussed yesterday and realised patrons probably wouldn't want to sleep on smelly beds, so I decided it might be best to remove them." Against an overwhelming desire not to, Oscar asked, "And where will they sleep then, Percival S. Minton?" "Well, to be quite honest, I hadn't really thought that far ahead." "Percival," Oscar said patiently, "2 things spring to mind. Firstly, I would have thought that washing and airing the sheets would have sufficed. And secondly, preoccupation with the state of the lobby ought to take priority, as it is impossible to offer visitors a bed if they're already gagging over the desk downstairs." The lift went ping, its doors opened and Oscar stepped from it. Percival, however, did not. Instead, he stared vacantly at the floor, oblivious to the second ping and subsequent closing of doors. With a weary sigh, Oscar stabbed at buttons again. When the lift reopened, Percival looked up and Oscar gestured that he follow. In his room, Oscar was relieved to find his luggage undisturbed, unlike the bed, which was indeed nowhere to be seen. Evidence of its eviction was apparent, however, in the broken window frame, its design having not anticipated bed insertion, which was a pity as it had been a nice window frame. Oscar went to it and peered at the street below. Sure enough, upon the pavement was a jumble of artistically stacked wire-framed beds, like a sculpture exploring the more extreme mechanics of slumber. Around them, curious pedestrians had gathered to debate its themes, at least those who hadn't been hit by them. He turned to Percival, who forlornly fluffed a lone pillow. "You really have no idea, do you?" With a quivering lip, Percival dropped the pillow and wiped at tearing eyes. Shaking his head, he admitted to having about as much idea as the animal who ordered floral arrangements for an asthmatics convention. Between sniffles, he explained he'd received a telephone call from the hotel's owners who'd fled to Purging shortly after the whole poo thing. So traumatised had they been, they wished nothing more to do with the place and bequeathed it to him. Oscar sighed and shook his head. The little dog couldn't keep his own fur free of poo, let alone a hotel covered in the stuff. If whatever was to befall Ruen could be thwarted, preventing Percival shoving furniture out of 3-story windows in an attempt at running a hotel would be simple. Moreover, if thwarting failed, pavements covered in beds and manure-streaked interiors would be the least of Ruen's concerns. "Look, Percival," he said, putting a paw upon the dog's pooey shoulder. "I promise that in a few days' time I shall help you get this hotel in some sort of order." Percival nodded at the floor, while paws wiped at eyes. "But first it appears I might need your help." The little dog beamed through tears. "Anything, Mr. Dooven." Oscar grappled with his luggage and heaved one of the suitcases into the middle of the floor. He opened it and took out pieces of equipment only velvet paws were permitted to see. The 3 animals arrived at Horace's at roughly the same time. When Bremble opened the door to the Derby, Oscar tumbled from a second taxi, clutching luggage. After they'd been ushered inside, Horace returned from his council meeting, leaving Bremble to usher him in after them. So enthusiastic was the Derby that she began describing her adventure before Horace had stepped through the doorway. She showered him in a rain of recount she'd only just showered upon Oscar. While Oscar dried himself, the Derby followed Horace down the hall and into his sitting room, where he listened with some difficulty, as her lisp's severity was proportional to eagerness. They sat then, as they had 2 nights before, with Horace trying to bridle the Derby's fervour. He had to. It was either restraint or drown. When she'd finished, he said to Oscar, "I am glad to see you safe, young cat, and I am sorry you suffered at the paws
Of those I've only ever done my best to serve.
Oscar shook his head. Not at all. I am a velvet paw of Asquith, and am trained in such things. I rescued him, the Derby said proudly. Their ordeal had left the cats hungry, so Bremble organised a tray piled high with sausages and crispy scales, alongside a large jug of chilled hot fin. We haven't eaten since the night before last, the Derby said, stuffing herself with most of it. Nor have we slept. Her words were staunch then, when physics forced her to retch some of it back up after only a passing glance at her stomach. Horace asked the Derby to start again, not with her food, obviously, but with what she'd been keen to share. So she explained again that Oscar had been right about the barge and the port, and described his capture by Sedovitz Tarpanu and her brave attempt at rescue. She stopped short, however, of mentioning the fate of his beloved Muppet Cedar. Horace listened with a frown before admitting the extraordinary council meeting he'd attended had been entirely that, extraordinary, in that the Pajami had ranted on about beautiful ironies and that tides were imminent in turn. More importantly, he realised that 2 days coincided with another of the Pajami's grand balls upon her yacht. Are they always held there? Oscar asked. Horace nodded.
They're rather lavish affairs, with only the most exclusive of guests.
I have never attended one, Bremble said, her disdain for the Pajami obvious, and I never will on principle. How many will attend? Horace shrugged.
100 or more.
And council members are always invited?
Certainly. Although beside the dozen or so making up the ruling council, they include the elite of Ruen, those content to ignore politics, having no interest in questioning the council's policies, provided their city remains as they desire it.
Yes, Oscar growled, and at any cost, apparently.
It is clear that the Pajami has orchestrated whatever is imminent without the council's involvement,
Horace said.
And for some reason included this young Sedovitz animal rather than my colleagues. I cannot imagine why. The Pajami is calculating and cruel and abhors any animal younger than she. Yet tonight she appeared thrilled in a manner that leaves me deeply concerned.
But we still don't know what is actually going to happen, the Derby reminded them. Or where.
Indeed,
Horace agreed.
Therefore, our knowing when means little.
Frowning, Oscar said, Actually, I have a suspicion as to the latter, but as far as what it might be, well, we'll just have to work that out when we get there. The Derby and Horace stared at him. Get there? The Derby said. Get where? The castle. I am certain that's where everything's brewing. While Horace stared, the Derby nodded. That could make sense, she said. It might explain where the barge came from. What was the port originally used for? Oscar asked.
It certainly hasn't been used for years,
Horace said.
I thought it was abandoned and was rather surprised when your suspicions turned out to be correct. It was used for industrial things, I believe, and receiving goods before roads linked Ruen to places further down the coast.
He looked at Oscar thoughtfully.
There is one thing lying within the port's vicinity, although it is hardly of significance, surely.
The cats waited.
Ruen's sewage outfall.
None of them said anything for a time, until the Derby gasped. Oh my goodness, she whispered. The irony of such revenge. They stared at her, and on shaky paws she stood. Don't you see? That's what all this is about. And she hit her head in having been betrayed a second time by the same animal. What on earth do you mean? Oscar asked. She turned to him, her eyes flaring from black to a brilliant amber. That cat, she cried. That double-crossing, arrogant animal has jilted me all along. She began pacing the room as much as her limp allowed, while Oscar and Horace looked at each other. I am responsible for all of this. Horace shook his head.
Not at all, my dear. Think nothing of the sort. You did what you felt necessary, and with protests never more than inconvenient.
You don't understand, she cried. He studied my chemistry for years, but not for the second autumn alone. Oh no, that is not the limit of his disgraceful deviance. When she began trembling, Bremble went to calm her. Don't you see, she pleaded. I should have known. Why didn't I see through him? I should have never trusted that cat. I swear, from this day forth, I shall never trust another animal again. Bremble squeezed her shoulders. What are you suggesting? Asked Oscar, having never seen her so distraught. He plans to vanquish us by the same means as we have inconvenienced them. And she stared at Horace, repeating his words. The irony of such revenge! Although Oscar didn't understand, Horace seemed caught in her current.
The beauty is in the irony of the revenge,
he realized as detail fell into place. When he stood and stared, he lost his monocle, leaving Bremble not knowing which animal deserved more consolation. Appalled, Horace and the Derby stared at each other. I taught him about powder pops.
It's not a party, it's an evacuation.
They could have been filling that barge for months.
They mean to purge, Ruen.
A nervous swallow squelched from the Derby. I drove your car off a cliff. Horace nodded.
I suspected as much. It seems to be something of a habit.
Oscar was indignant then. Would one of you please enlighten me? I feel to be thinking almost entirely in Braille. Horace blinked and looked at him with difficulty. Falling back into his chair, he dabbed his eyes.
Young cat,
he said, no better for sitting.
Your efforts have permitted us to see all too clearly. I fear you are right. There are plans to unleash upon Ruen devastation far beyond our imagining. A purging via means most foul that intends to wipe out the entire population, save for those safe aboard the spicy Cabanari.
With slow nods of certainty, he added,
and perhaps the only place such horror could be unleashed is indeed from a lair such as the castle of Ruen.
But how? Oscar demanded. You said yourself the castle is impregnable, yet if we're right, then there must be some means of access and some way of hiding that barge. Horace and the Derby stared, unable to offer anything further. When Oscar banged a paw upon his chair, his glass of hot Fin toppled. He grabbed it and then stared. Blinking, he then had a bit of a think about it. Of course, he whispered. That's it. What an extraordinary coincidence they've discovered. For the barge emerging during a new moon is not only for reasons of stealth. Horace asked what on earth he meant. What happens during the times you have seen the barge? Oscar asked eagerly. Horace thought.
Well, it's dark, of course.
Yes, but besides that, what does the lack of moon influence?
The tides?
Exactly. The Derby blinked at him. You think the tides affect the castle? Oscar shook his head. No, but I will bet you that when the tide is low, an entrance to the castle is revealed in the cliffs beneath. Horace's eyes widened.
My goodness, I never thought of that. It's certainly plausible.
And I'd wager further that's how they've managed to pull this whole thing off so secretly. What do you mean? Asked the Derby. Well, unless it's a new moon, the castle would be a veritable island. And do you think the Pajami and Sedovitz could orchestrate something so monumental with their 4 paws alone? I mean, where do you think all the animals we saw at the port reside when they're not upon the barge? He waited for them to catch up. I told you there was activity at that castle. The Derby stared at the floor, thinking, and my father. It might offer explanation as to why Ruen has so little crime after all. She looked at them both. The Pajami could have recruited an army of criminals to work on this whole purging thing without any other animal being aware. It would certainly explain a great deal, agreed Oscar. The Derby flopped back into her chair, dumbfounded. Horace wondered the same.
If animals were indeed taken there, they could remain hidden indefinitely. After all, the castle was designed for siege, and they would have no choice but to do her bidding.
There could be 100 of them, Oscar realised. But if there were, they could certainly overwhelm a scraggy old bag like the Pajami and that stooge Sedovitz. Why on earth would they not revolt?
Against what?
Horace asked.
Having their sentence annulled, perhaps a place in the New World. Who knows what incentive the Pajami would offer for their loyalty? Regardless, it is a gilded cage, the most beautiful of prisons.
He nodded to himself.
That wicked cat would offer any incentive to win favour. In the end, however, she would have no scruples in honouring not a word of it.
Horace and Oscar looked at each other. We have to get to that castle, Oscar said. Although Horace agreed, he shook his head.
I'm sorry, but you are both at the end of your tethers, and I can see them fraying. Neither of you are going anywhere until you've had some proper rest.
But his suggestion was unnecessary, for the decision was already made. Whether it was exhaustion or having a full tummy while Bremble stroked her fur, the Derby was already sound asleep upon the chair. The next morning, the Derby wrote a letter to her father explaining their suspicions, which Bremble agreed to deliver later that evening. The plan agreed to was simple. Horace remained convinced the Pajami would demand an audience for her purging, which suggested the yacht would sail for the castle. Horace would attend the ball as invited, while Oscar and the Derby would follow in a small boat of his, from which they'd hoped to see how entry was gained. Once in the castle, they'd infiltrate proceedings and foil any act of purge. While Horace left to ensure his boat was ready, Oscar and the Derby organised various things in his sitting room, amply catered for by Bremble through an inexhaustible supply of hot fin. The Derby was particularly interested in the contents of Oscar's special suitcase, as they were clearly for the eyes of Velvet Paws alone.